Okay, so we heard from Neil that seed forms don't necessarily work. So as the professional futurist over the last 10 years, I'm here to say that seed forms do matter. But as they say in the X-Files, the truth is out there. So don't believe either of us. Investigate for yourself. So yeah, the future. Why does the future start in seed form? So from the point of view of, let's see, what's this? Yeah, so from the perspective of foresight, the seeds of today become dominant forms of tomorrow. So we talk about emerging issues. And so we can think about Cosmo-localism as an emerging issue, or in other terms, people also say weak signal. A weak signal is the metaphor of the radar. And sometimes when you're looking at a radar, you're looking for what's in the distance. You only see a kind of a faint blip. But then it gets stronger and stronger. So the weak signal becomes a strong signal. And understanding this can help us leverage its potential and identify the threats and the blind spots. In foresight, we talk about an S-curve, a maturity and diffusion model. So we look at the development of technology and social innovations through here, starting with ideation, prototyping, and refining. We talk about first applications and value, then going up as diffusion increases sustainability and scaling, replication and fast adoption, maturation and saturation. So when we think about Cosmo-localism, this is just a really quick sort of mapping of some of the enterprises and projects in the area. Some of these things are just ideas, like Backfeed, which is a blockchain-based way to do open value accounting. Other things like WikiHouse actually have applications. People are actually building these things in different parts of the world. Things like FarmBot, yeah, actually even more, right? They're beginning to sell their machines. And then other things like Open Motors, Sensorica, OpenDesk are beginning to gather a little bit of energy. And then if you look at these two on the top here, Linux and Wikipedia, they've become dominant forms. If you go back 20 years or 30 years, you'd say, well, it's just this marginal thing. But over time, as this, and social change is a complex affair. You cannot just say it's one thing or another. But over time, they did become dominant. So when we think of solar energy started with a guy named Buckminster Fuller and others dreaming about the power of the sun. Then it became a research topic, a prototype, and then fast forward 40 years, it's the fastest growing energy source that we have, and it's one of our best chances of replacing fossil fuels. When we think about WikiLeaks, the example of WikiLeaks, 15, 16 years ago, Julian Assange was blogging the idea for WikiLeaks. He was just a crazy guy. That's all he was. Just a crazy guy. Right? Fast forward, and then he's prototyping it in Berlin with colleagues. And then fast forward a little bit more, and he's leaking major things from major governments. And now he's he's in jail awaiting extradition to the US, right? But either as dream or as nightmare, the future begins in a dark alley. It begins where it's difficult to see. And what we're doing in this space here is we've got a microscope and we're expanding that view of what actually exists, right? And we're looking at some of those examples in seed forms. So we see successes like FarmBot, and we see successes like OpenDesk. But these are commercial expressions. And we have other more sort of commons-oriented expressions, more collective expressions. So this is Farm Hack in the northeastern United States, and they have a few people doing things elsewhere. They come together to prototype farm equipment and develop farm equipment, and they keep all those designs open so other farmers elsewhere can use them. And there's a similar group in France called l'Atelier Paysans, and they get support from the government. They're also a cooperative, and they essentially build and prototype farm equipment together. Again, supporting each other in their own livelihoods, keeping those designs open. So the basic idealized concept of Cosmo-localism can be sort of summarized in this diagram. So we have local producers that are involved in peer production, local producers who are creating the things they need for each other. If they keep those open, then there's a global design pool. And that pool expands the repertoire, expands the designs that anyone, anywhere can actually use. And then all those designs can then circulate back to the local so that local communities, local people can then take those and use those when they need to use those. And so this is an idealized, virtuous cycle of how cosmo-localization can work. And it's basically planetary knowledge mutualization. When I was working on my PhD, I met Michel Bowens in 2006, and he planted this seed in my mind, this idea. And this is way back. The idea of pseudo-abundance is based on the mistaken premise of infinite material growth on a finite planet. We've been hearing that all day. We cannot have infinite material growth on a finite planet, where natural resources are actually fundamentally limited. Alternatively, all artificial scarcity refers to the strategies that prevent the sharing of technological and scientific progress because of excessively restrictive intellectual property rights. So on one hand, we have a limited biosphere. We have to be able to live within an ecological budget. On the other hand, our economy treats knowledge as if it's scarce. And Michel was saying back in 2006, it's artificial scarcity. It's artificial. A sensible alternative is to recognize the limits of what we can use from the world of nature, of which we are an intrinsic part, and to allow for the sharing of all knowledge that can contribute to living within the limits of this biocapacity. Which is to say that if we are going to solve our climate crisis, what we need is a planetary knowledge mutualization. We need to create an openness at a global level where we're sharing the solutions that are required to solve the climate crisis. And we can accelerate the solutions that we create by having the knowledge open and shared. That's planetary knowledge mutualization. And so with that seed that Michel planted so many years ago, I've been on this journey with others here. But there are contradictions, and the contradictions are pretty stark. So some enterprises seemingly on the cusp of cosmo-local production have not been able to go all the way. If they want to get investment capital from angel investors or venture capitalists, they can't make their designs open. Investors always want a return on their investment. If you're creating designs and making them open source, they don't want to even get near you. if you're using other people's open source knowledge to make money, then they love you. So one of the fundamental contradictions in this space of open source is that big corporates have been quick to adopt open source platforms, such as Linux and Android. But nonprofits committed to open source, such as the Open Food Network, create value, right? But how do they, and then other people are using that value, but how does value return to them in a capitalist economy? So we begin to see the contradictions. Contradiction number one is, make your designs free and open and lose your ability to return value to your enterprise. Contradiction two is, make your designs free and open and support capitalism as usual. So this contradiction exists because we live within a capitalist political economy. Today's global neoliberalism, capitalism on steroids. The political economy is a system for the 1%. If we look at Thomas Piketty's study, right, he studied investment over the last decades, and investment over the last decades is for the 1%, fundamentally. It's about extracting value irregardless of social and ecological consequences. It's a mindless accumulation machine. And it's a political economy. It's not just an economic system. That is to say that it structures political relations and policy in its own interests. Therefore, we increasingly live in a world of oligarchs, of people with great wealth, who influence political systems for the purpose of defending and expanding their wealth. So I want to give an example. Diabetes is a life-threatening illness associated with an inability to produce insulin, which affects our body's capacity to produce glucose. In 1923, Frederick Banting, Charles Best, and James Collip sold the patent for insulin to the University of Toronto for $1 each. So they sold the patent for insulin for $1. Because they thought that this discovery was so important, they thought it should be available to everyone. Now, today, it's impossible to get any insulin in the United States without paying exorbitant fees. The cost of insulin tripled from 2002 to 2013 and doubled between 2012 and 2016. In 1996, a vial of Humalog cost $21. Today, it's $324. It's an increase of 1,400%. So those without insurance pay thousands of dollars per month just to access insulin. So diabetes has become the most expensive disease in the United States. So by wrapping insulin production in a convoluted and labyrinthine system of process patents, pharmaceuticals have been able to create artificial scarcity, something which should be a global knowledge commons, which the founders sold to their university for $1, has now become so expensive that it makes people bankrupt who have diabetes and who don't have insurance. Now, that knowledge is part of the human legacy of design. That is the human legacy of knowledge creation. Why should that knowledge be wrapped up in process patents when people are actually dying? If that knowledge becomes part of the global knowledge commons, global design commons, then it potentiates many people's lives. People in many places can set up, through cooperatives, through other enterprise systems, they can do it. They can create it. So the dilemma, so here's an example of, this is a biohacking lab in Oakland. And so there's a project called the Open Insulin Project in Oakland, California, which is attempting to bypass the pharmaceuticals by creating their own insulin products. They're essentially biohacking insulin. And they've been successful at prototyping a new method of producing insulin using modified yeast as the agent. And they've produced their first test batch. And there's really difficult rules in the United States with the Food and Drug Administration. So they can't sell it, but you can produce it and use it on yourself. So what they're doing is they're prototyping it, creating first batches, and then using it on themselves. But they're up against great odds. They're up against a hostile system. So for me, the dilemma becomes a little clearer. In the current political economy, those cosmo-local enterprises that are willing to play by the rules of capital may survive and thrive. They will be design platforms that allow distributed production and manufacturing, but the designs they use will never be truly open, and the enterprise or platform will be owned by a few founders and investors, rather than many people. So Neil talked about MakerBot. That was a very good example. It started out as an open source project, but then it quickly got colonized by capital. Cosmo-local enterprises which refuse to play by the rules of capital will continue to keep their designs open, but these designs will be appropriated and used by commercial entities. And these commons-based enterprises will struggle to be viable. So that's the challenge, or that's the contradiction. So what do we do then in this situation? We can wait around for the next political economy to come by, like a train, but that could take a while, and we might not get the one that we actually want. So the Great Depression and World War II ushered in Keynesian economics, social democracy, the non-aligned movement, and socialism. It took a massive crisis to create a modest social contract that regulated capital and provided for basic needs. But it was bloody and painful, and the crisis could have gone either way. Fascism could have prevailed, and we would now be living in Philip K. Dick's science fiction novel, The Man in the High Castle, where the Nazis actually ruled the world with the Japanese. Today's climate is even more dangerous than what we had 60 years ago. With the threat of climate change, water wars, mass migration, populist xenophobic backlash against globalization, the next crisis is not guaranteed to go our way. And as we've seen from politics around the world, there are certain trends that we have to take very seriously. So how do we not wait for the next crisis, but actually bootstrap a new political economy or economies to create new systems that allow for commons-based cosmo-local potential to thrive? So clues come from here and there. So I'm going to talk about another project that's really interesting that I learned from Michelle Bowens and others when I visited Mumbai. This is called SOLS, Solar Ujra Lamp Project, a project initiated by the Indian Institute of Technology around 2013-14. Many rural villagers in India have to keep they don't have any lighting. And to light at night, they use kerosene. They use kerosene lamps. Kerosene is dirty and it's associated with health problems. And it costs money. Like, not all villagers are able to afford kerosene in their actual villages. So the SOLS project aimed to directly impact the livelihood and well-being of rural villagers by replacing the use of kerosene with solar lamps. The solar lamps were designed based on open hardware, open source, which allowed the project to reduce the cost of the lamps. So we already begin to see some elements of the cosmo-local potential. Solar lamp repair centers were established to service the villages that received the lamps. You can't just give out lamps, right? So they're not going to continue working, right? So they developed repair centers. Locals were trained in the repair centers to repair the lamps, and a service model was developed whereby they would earn sufficient income from the ongoing servicing of the lamps. The lamps ended up being cheaper for the villagers than running kerosene lamps, and created jobs. On top of this, the project established a cooperative for the production of solar panels. So in that region, there's a co-op which actually makes solar panels that also goes into the project. And this drives a new supply of panels to existing and new regions of the scheme. So the projects demonstrated the strong benefits, such as increasing the health of people in the village, increased educational performance by the children in the village, and this is not to mention the carbon emissions reduction from phasing out kerosene. The project shows how an anchor institution, this idea of an anchor institution is the idea of an institution which can be large enough to form the basis of new supply chains and new ecosystems of value, can be the basis of the development of an ecosystem which is able to recirculate value in new and virtuous ways. The example points to the crux of the challenge that we face if we want to create a world in which open designs potentiate and support local livelihoods. So I'm going to talk about three main things. The first is the Peer-to-Peer Foundation colleagues came up with this idea of a peer-to-peer license. And the idea of a peer-to-peer license is simply that if I create something which, like insulin, let's take insulin as an example. If I create a solution for people to produce insulin that's open, what's not to say that the same thing is going to happen again? That the pharmaceuticals come in, it used to cost $1, but they're going to wrap it all up in process patents over time. What's to say that's not going to happen? So the idea of a peer-to-peer license is that the new insulin product is licensed with a peer-to-peer license that allows other open source enterprises or co-ops to access it at a reduced cost, or if they're reciprocating value for free. There's different ways to think about it. But if they're a commercial entity, then they have to pay a commercial price back to the open source foundation that holds the peer-to-peer license. You now have a mechanism for returning value back into the commons. Right? So the peer-to-peer license is a very important conceptual innovation. It hasn't been trialed sufficiently. It needs more work, but it's one of those promising ideas. The second idea that's coming out is use the blockchain. Right? If value is leaking out of the commons economy and being appropriated by other entities, then the blockchain might be a way of doing an accounting system. So there's an example, I think it's Backfeed, where they're attempting to do open accounting. Again, it's a prototype, right? But as people create something which is of value for a community, there's a way of tracking that value and tokenizing that value. And then from this project here, from the Souls project in India, in Maharashtra, we have an institutional response, which is create an anchor institution which is able to bootstrap, it's able to kickstart a micro-political economy. It's able to create its own norms, incentive systems to create new livelihoods and new systems based on a different model. So this brings me to the role of the urban commons. So what's happening in Bologna, Ghent, and Seoul, and elsewhere with the urban commons is potentially transformational. This is a book by Sharable. I'm sure Neil's told you all about it, but it's a It's an amazing resource of urban commoning activity. It shows great pathways forward. So when we talk about anchor institutions able to bootstrap the development of new value circulating systems, we normally think on the scale of organizations like hospitals or universities that have large-scale capacity to do a thing called social procurement, to force their supply chains to take a new approach to supplying the things that the university or the hospital needs. Say, the hospital will say, well, we'll take that service, but we're going to take it from a cooperative. Or we'll take that service, but we're going to take it from an open source provider. When we think about the urban commons, we're dealing with an order of magnitude greater than just a few institutions. So if we take on board Christian Ioni's vision of the urban commons, this includes universities, governments, businesses, civil society organizations, and citizens practicing urban collaborative governance. Then we have a scale larger than one anchor institution. The urban commons essentially allows us to think about how we might bootstrap, how we might kickstart a political economy for the commons on a city scale. We can think of this idea of the urban commons working across asymmetrical organizational forms. Asymmetrical meaning they don't look the same. They don't act the same. They're quite different. The logic embedded within them are actually quite different. That's asymmetry. Between universities, social innovators, the government, civil society, and business, the logic underneath each one of those is actually quite distinct and quite different. But we know that cities are so key in so many crucial areas. It's where carbon emissions need to come down to reduce emissions. It's where professional expertise is found. It's where the markets are, and it's where most people are going to live in the 21st century. So what if cities demanded a circular economy function within its geographical boundary? And between it and the broader value chains it depends on and supports? What if cities emphasize their capacity for auto-productivity to support localized production, as we've seen with these examples today, using new Cosmo-local potentials? From the seeds of change that we see expressed in the Cosmo-local logic, such as the Souls Project, we know that such meta-scale anchoring at a higher level, an urban commons with depth, could and would be a pop-up political economy with real power, with real potential, within which new rules, new incentives, new norms, and possibilities to support generative social and economic activities rather than extractive ones would exist. We can also see that such generative value circulation at the scale of cities might use new technologies like distributed ledger systems, like the blockchain, to tokenize value exchange. These sub-economies would be a new force with real scale. And of course, we could see the protocol cooperativism, the city-to-city mutualization that Michelle Bawens has talked about, where cities across the world mutualize resources, working as well. So I'd just like to end with one point, which is Seoul, on the vanguard of the urban commons, holds with it the possibility of this kind of transformation. Thank you very much.